Tonight, 1 Corinthians chapter 7. So sit tight. Y'all been waiting for this for a while? Getting right back on the horse. So we'll be right back. Welcome to Tanakh Talk. I am your host, William Hall, broadcasting live out of Kingsland, Texas, USA, with another episode of A Rabbi Cross Examines the New Testament with Rabbi Michael Skobac from the northern lands of the U.S., Canada. I guess I really can't say that because they're really not of the U.S., I guess. Welcome back, Rabbi. Good to see you again. Good to see you again. Hey, I am curious. I was going to ask you earlier so we wouldn't have to do it on the show, but if I don't ask you now, I won't. What is the temperature there? Because it's miserable here. Oh, my gosh. In the daytime. 4 o'clock in the afternoon.
What's the temperature here?
Yes.
You want it in Celsius or in Fahrenheit?
Fahrenheit. I don't want it at all, actually. Oh, man. We've been
I think it was in the 20s today.
That would be that. Now, see, that made me feel better for about a half a second, and then I realized what you did there. That's good.
So
that's good.
Probably Fahrenheit today was in the maybe upper 70s, low 80s, or something like that.
Oh my gosh. Okay, now
probably upper 70s today. I think upper 70s.
Okay. That makes me feel really good, even though we didn't have that. I long for those type of days. Wow, that's really cool. Nice. Well, can you believe that this is show number 499 on Tanakh
Wow.
Talk? Almost 500 shows that we've done.
Wow.
It's crazy. Altogether, of course. I think you and I are on episode number 87-ish, something like that. Almost 100 for you and I. And so it's been a fun journey, and we've got a long way to go.
Yeah, that's really amazing.
So you know what's going to happen is after we get to the point where we start finishing up the New Testament, we're going to have to start doing a full series on like Jewish history or something fun, something that we could just kind of roll right off on into. So I know you do a really good Jewish history course, but we'll have to do like an ultra zoom in, right?
We got a few
years to go left
until we finish
yeah.
the New Testament.
plenty of time to be pondering those ideas later on down the road.
Even if we go, in the express lanes on the highway and we do 2 or 3 chapters a night,
mm-hmm.
We've got a little bit of, we got a little bit of road ahead of us.
Right. Yeah. That is very true. Very true. Cool. Well, awesome. So yeah, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and we'll kick this thing off. So I'll follow along with your New Testament read off as usual. So take it away, boss. Okay.
So this. It's been a while. I mean, it's good to be back with you.
Thank you.
I had a couple of off weeks for a number of reasons. This is a very famous chapter, actually, in 1 Corinthians. This is a chapter where Paul deals with marriage and sex, among a few other topics. But this is one which is very frequently referred to by many different authors. And it's hard to understand, actually, the beginning of the chapter, verse 1, because this is Paul writing. Paul says, "Now, concerning the matters about which you wrote." So obviously, the church in Corinth wrote to Paul. Again, we know that he was not in Corinth when he wrote his letter to them, but he's writing to them, and he says, "Look, about that which you had written to me," Paul says, and now I don't know if these quotation marks appear. I suspect they don't in the original manuscripts, whatever
right.
they may have been.
Right.
But I think many texts will actually have this in quotation marks here, where Paul says, "About which you wrote," quote, I know this is translated in different ways. Sometimes you'll find it says it's good for a man not to touch a woman. Some people will say it's good for a man to be celibate. The various translations will actually try to phrase this in a number of different ways, they all come out to essentially the same thing. So Paul basically says, look, you guys wrote to me, and you wrote, quote, it's good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. And obviously, how do I react to that? Now, what's strange, at least to me, is that in the preceding chapters, Paul has been chastising the Corinthians for pretty low behavior on their part. They were accused of, being petty and being, backbiting and bickering, and then he gets into, lewd behavior and immoral behavior, and they were womanizing, and they were hanging out with prostitutes. I mean, in the previous 6 chapters, he's been really letting them have it with both barrels. And so what's strange is that, Paul says now, look, you guys wrote to me that you said it's good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. It's hard to imagine that these Corinthians would be proposing something like this. It's just hard to imagine that these low characters that Paul's been dealing with, they're advocating that people be celibates. Like, what's going on here? So it could be that he's received this from just a few people at the church. Maybe many of the church were problematic in terms of the behavior, and maybe they had a few goody two shoes people. It's hard to know. So maybe that's what's going on. Many commentaries seem to suspect that the quotations here is because the people in Corinth who were writing to Paul, they were quoting something that they had heard from him. So either this is something that was being quoted in the name of Paul, or he had written this to someone, maybe in a private letter. But some people explain that this idea that it's good not to have relations with women is not something the Corinthians came up with, but they're saying to Paul, look, Paul, we heard that you've taught this idea, and what's the deal? That might be what's maybe the most likely scenario here. So Paul says, now concerning the matters about which you wrote, and he quotes their letter, which was quoting him, right? Meaning that basically what Paul's saying is, you guys probably want to know what I meant by that, right? What did I mean when I had this saying? That it's good for people not to have sexual relations. Now, we know that Paul was celibate. We know that Paul was not married. And it's interesting that Paul was essentially following Jesus, who as far as at least the Christian Bible is concerned, was never married either. Despite the fact that the Da Vinci Code and a lot of other modern, people insist that Jesus really was married and did have children. I don't think there's any evidence for that. I think that if we accept the idea there was a historical person named Jesus of Nazareth, it seems, according to the best information we have, that he was never married. So basically, this idea that Paul may have been advocating celibacy is something that we'll see later in the chapter. He says, I wish that, people were like me and didn't get married. And we know Paul didn't get married. And we know that, he probably either knew about the life of Jesus, that Jesus never married, or they just happened to both be people who never married. What's interesting question is, at what age did Paul become a follower of Jesus? When is it that Paul actually first became a believer in Jesus as the Messiah? I don't know if anyone really discusses this. I just was wondering about it myself because, if we can imagine his experience on the road to Damascus didn't take place when he was 15 years old. I imagine it was more likely that he was 25, 30. It's hard to know. But let's say he was 30 years old when he has this conversion experience. So I guess the question would be, why wasn't Paul married before this? Meaning that if Paul's decision not to marry was a result of his conversion experience, and he was 30 years old at the time, probably 99% of Jewish men got married way before they were 30 years of age. They probably got married when they were 18 or 19 or 20. So I'm just wondering out loud, I don't have an answer to this, is like, what was the story with Paul? I mean, why wasn't he married prior to himself becoming a follower of Jesus? In any event, we see that it could be that Jesus himself taught something along these lines, because in Matthew chapter 19, verse 12, Jesus writes, or they quote Jesus as saying, that some choose not to marry. Actually, the literal, I think, is to be a eunuch for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. So some choose not to marry for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. And then Jesus says, let anyone accept this, let anyone who can accept this can. Meaning, let anyone accept it.
Let's see what's going on here.
This, right? They should. Let anyone accept this who can. So he seems to be indicating that not marrying, don't just follow my example, Jesus is saying. He seems to be actually teaching this, that, to be a eunuch for the kingdom of heaven, for the sake of the kingdom of heaven, would be a good thing, and he seems to even advocate it. Now, I once heard, I never tracked this down, that the early, I think, 2nd century church father Eusebius actually castrated himself because he wanted to be a eunuch for the kingdom. I think because in the gospel it says that if your hand, offends you,
cut it off,
your hand, right? Mm-hmm. And so he wanted to basically cut off the offensive part of his anatomy. That was the way he became a holy person, by becoming a self-inflicted eunuch for the kingdom of heaven. So it seems that what we're going to encounter in this chapter from Paul is that on some level, based upon the teaching of Jesus, based upon the model of Jesus, based upon his own life, based upon, again, what Paul seems to have taught, which the Corinthians are quoting here, it's good for a man not to have relations with a woman. It seems that the ideal is to remain celibate. But what Paul seems to develop in response to the Corinthians is, look, even though that's the ideal, and even though that's the preferred status, but Paul recognizes that there are people who would not be able to handle that. There are people who, would not be able to control themselves sexually, and to place them in a situation where they don't have any legitimate sexual outlet would lead them to sin and to, engage in forbidden sexual relationships. That would be a bigger disaster. So Paul, makes it very clear in this chapter that even though there is an ideal, a preferred state, he actually speaks about, his ability to remain celibate as a gift that he has, but he speaks about those people who don't have that gift. And so if people don't have the gift of being able to remain without getting married, Paul says that they should actually, it would be appropriate for them to marry and to have normal sexual relationships, because otherwise they're just looking for trouble. And so you do find in this chapter, both Paul allowing for marriage and allowing for physical relationships within marriage, and not putting it down. He doesn't say that the people who do that are lesser or on a spiritually lower level, but he certainly, in many ways, makes it very clear that, at least from his point of view, there is a preferred kind of existence. And so that seems to be the general thrust of this chapter, that um, Paul does believe that remaining single would be the ideal, but he doesn't feel that this should be imposed on everyone because some people may not be able to control themselves. So that's the way the general. Um,
How does that flow with the commandment to be fruitful and multiply, though?
I am going to discuss this in a big way.
Oh, cool. All right, good.
Yeah, what I'm going to do, I mean, the truth is that this would be, 2 hours just to go through all of the Torah sources on this topic. I'm going to just do a little survey. But
One thing,
clearly,
just a quick question, is something that I never really understood until the later years, was that be fruitful and multiply wasn't a suggestion, and to me it actually just seemed like it. It seemed like, God, now you've got the power to do this, so you can go out here and do this now, and you can do this. I never really realized it was an actual command to do that. So
yeah,
until
I always found
later
it
on,
was strange that what you'll hear from many Christians is that Jesus perfectly fulfilled the law. That's almost
That
like
is a good one. I never thought about
right?
correlating the two together. Oh my gosh, you're right.
But here's the first commandment, which that doesn't seem to have been much of an attempt on his part, meaning that you know he didn't even get married. I mean, it's interesting that people are not able to control everything in their lives, right? So a person is only, in terms of the commandment, responsible for trying. The person's not in control of whether they're going to have children or not. They can only try.
Right.
That's why the Talmud says that when a person at the end of their life faces their maker, one of the questions they're going to be asked is, did you try to have a family? Not did you have a family? So Jesus, didn't even bother to get married. And so, there is a commandment to at least attempt to have a family, to have children. And, when Christians say, sort of casually, that Jesus perfectly fulfilled the Torah, the law, this is a big uh-oh. Big uh-oh moment is that the very first commandment in the Torah seems to have been ignored by him. So, Paul, again, I'm just going to repeat verse 8. To the unmarried and the widows, I say that it's good for them to remain single as I. Right, Paul, at least he puts he's his shingle up, and he's saying, look, I'm single, and I never married, and he's saying that if you're not married, or if you've been widowed, or whatever, it's a good thing to stay single and not to marry. But he says in verse 9, but if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry, for it's better to marry than to burn. And I think many translations say to burn with passion, meaning that essentially what Paul says is that this is a concession. I think that's what he's really saying, that ideally you should stay single. If you're not able to, because you don't have the gift, as Paul describes it, you're not able to control yourself, you might actually end up doing really bad things. He says, okay, as a concession, you can get married. But what's interesting, and that's what I wanted to get into now, is that when you read this chapter, 1 Corinthians 7, and Paul discusses marriage, and he discusses a lot of ideas about marriage, he seems to have a one-track mind, in that for Paul, it seems, at least in this chapter, that the only benefit of being married is to prevent licentious sexual outlets, meaning that seems to be the only focus that Paul has, and his concern about that, his concern about people who can't control themselves, and do they have a legitimate outlet for their sexual needs. The question is that the view of the Torah, Is that the view of the Bible? Is this the only consideration when, the Torah the Torah writes about, the role of marriage, the purpose of physical relationships? And that's what I wanted to spend a few minutes just going through a few sources. But again, this would be a massive topic to cover comprehensively. So as we just said, the first mitzvah, the first commandment in the Torah from Genesis chapter 1, verse 28 is God's a commandment. As you said, it's not a suggestion. Pru, be fruitful and multiply. And this is sort of echoed in Isaiah chapter 45, verse 18, I believe, where Isaiah says that God formed the world to be inhabited, meaning that human beings have a responsibility to populate the world. So it's not just something that we hear about in Genesis chapter 1, but the prophet Isaiah sort of amplifies this by saying that we have a responsibility to populate the world. And so it's interesting, there is an idea in philosophy of what they call the categorical imperative. And it's the idea that, you can judge the merit of a behavior or a philosophy based upon what happens if everyone does it. Meaning that, if you want to determine whether something is right or wrong, so if you ask yourself, well, what if everyone did what I'm going to do? It would be a disaster. So if it would be a disaster, then that's not good. Don't think about your personal behavior. Think about what happens if that behavior becomes international policy. Everyone does it.
Interesting.
So, if everyone adopted Paul's philosophy here, the world would just stop existing. You can't go on like that. Now, it's interesting that in the creation of human beings, when we go to chapter 1 of Genesis, this is something which is often not appreciated when you read the Bible in translation. But in Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, the Torah says, "In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them." That's a literal translation. In the image of God, he, meaning God, he created him. And male and female, he created them. So it seems that the pronouns are a bit out of skew here. And based upon this, the Talmud teaches in two places, in Ketubot 8a and in Yevamot 63a. The Talmud suggests that, and this is going to sound a little bit out there for people, the Talmud suggests that the original creation, the original creature that God created, was actually hermaphroditic. That the first being that was created was both male and female. Mm-hmm. And that's why we know that one being was created, and that's why it says, in the image of God, he created him, meaning that the first being was in the image of God, and male and female, he created them. So the human beings were created as a combination of both masculine and feminine.
See, I've heard that, or I've kind of assumed sort of that idea, but not that they were all, but only Adam, right, was created this way, and then God divided him. But
this was
is that kind of what
he was the first one off the assembly belt,
right?
Once Adam and Eve were created, then, and because again, what the Talmud posits, what the mystical sources posit, is that they were created hermaphroditic. They were both, that the first being was male and female. Actually, they painted as they were back to back, and they were separated. And so that's the way Eve came into existence. Eve was basically separated off of Adam, right? He was separated from him. The point here, though, is that what we discover is that the ideal reality is for us to be um, together, I mean attached. We're supposed to be basically a unit. And that when we become a couple, when we become separate individuals, male and female, the ultimate goal is to reunite. And so this idea of being single, right, not getting married, doesn't really fit into God's plan. God had us originally together, male and female, as one creature, to really teach us the ideal state. The ideal state is that we should be unified together. The ideal state is not to be separate male and female that live a separate existence, as Paul advocates. So the wording of the Torah seems to really teach us what the ideal state is. The ideal state is as we originally were created to be unified, a unified being. And that only takes place through marriage and through a relationship. This is really, it's interesting, this is the way we find ourselves, by sort of connecting with our other half. And so it really allows us to become who we were intended to be. Now, when you get into the second chapter of Genesis, so something very interesting happens. So God says in Genesis chapter 2, verse 18, it's not good that man should be alone. So right at the very beginning of the Bible, you have God refuting Paul's philosophy. Paul is saying that it's good. It's good not to marry. That's basically what Paul is saying.
Right.
But God says no. God says it's not good for a man to be alone. And he says that I'm going to make a help counterpart for him, an Ezer Kenegdo. I'm going to create for this first human being, I'm going to have a counterpart. There's going to be, two parts to this human being. It's going to be like a record album, side A and side B. And so this creature is going to have a partner, a help counterpart, as the Bible says. And, this other part of who we are, there's many reasons for why they're supposed to be together. Part of it is for companionship. Part of it is to help the other really complete who they are as human beings. There are so many reasons why people are supposed to be together as a couple. It's not just to, satisfy their urges. It's sort of built into the creation itself is the fact that as human beings, we are only able to reach our potential through discovering our other half, and that other half is a help to us. It's a counterpart, and it provides the context through which we're able to grow as a human being. And so what happens as the chapter moves along is that God caused a deep sleep to descend upon Adam, and he forms Eve from Adam's side. And again, this idea of removing part of Adam from himself, it sort of symbolizes the idea that we were meant to be united from the very beginning. And that's why when Adam wakes up, what does he say in verse 23 of chapter 2? He says, "This time she is love of my love and flesh of my flesh." The Bible goes on to say, right after this in verse 24, "Therefore shall a man leave his mother and father and cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh." So right at the very, very beginning of the Bible, I mean, you couldn't have this painted in sort of in stronger terms. The Bible is giving us a theology of the importance of men and women coming together and forming couples to help themselves grow and to provide companionship and an arena for love. And I'm going to show in a few minutes why those are so important on a spiritual level. Okay. But in terms of just human beings reaching their personal potential, this ability to really grow through a life with our counterpart is so critical. And we were not meant to go it alone, as Paul advocates. It's not the way of the Bible. Now, maybe I'll just talk about that now for a minute. We know that in the philosophy of the Torah, human beings were put into this world in order to have a relationship with God. I just finished my class earlier tonight on the path of the righteous, path of the upright, and the Ramchal quoted King David, who says, "As for me, the closeness to God is good." This is the ultimate good, is closeness with God. And David says, "There's one thing I asked, and only one thing, and that's to sit in the house of the Lord all the days of my life." The message of the Bible is that we were put here in this world in order to have a relationship with God and to become close with God and to attach ourselves to God. It's very interesting that the very same word that the Bible uses to describe the closeness of Adam and Eve and of all couples, that they should become, that man should leave his father and mother and attach himself to his wife, this is the same word, devekut, that the Torah uses repeatedly to speak about the closeness of a relationship we're supposed to build with God. So the Bible uses a very powerful, dramatic word. The very same word used to speak about the physical attachment between a man and a wife, that's what the Bible says we're supposed to do with God, to attach ourselves to God. So how do we do that? How do we get close to God? How do we build this kind of intimacy with God? And so one of the rules of the Torah is v'halachta b'drachav, to walk in his ways, meaning that the way we become close to God is becoming godly ourselves, becoming like God. And we do this by modeling ourselves after God. The way God is in the world, that's what we're supposed to do. And so one of the first things we learn about God is that he loves and he gives. The book of Psalms says that the world was created out of loving kindness. It's an act of love. And we know that the way in which love manifests is in giving, not in taking, but in giving. And so the way that we can become like God is ourselves becoming givers, becoming people who are givers. And where does that happen? Where are we able to become true givers? So what we learn here is that marriage is the ultimate arena where we're able to live as givers. It's something which, in a marriage, it's basically constant. It's ongoing. When it comes to the other people in our lives, it's much more periodical, happens occasionally. But to be able to live a life of being a giver, that takes place in the context of a marriage with our spouse and with children, because there the giving is 24/7, basically. And so we know that love is connected with giving, because the Hebrew word for love is ahava. Ahava is love. And the root of ahava is hav. And the word hav means to give. So these words of giving and loving are connected. And they're also related numerically, because the Hebrew word ahava, which is spelled aleph, hey, bet, hey, equals 13. Aleph is the number 1, hey is the number 5, and bet is 2, and hey is 5. That equals 13. And the word echad, 1, is 13 as well. Echad is spelled aleph, chet, daled. Aleph is 1, chet is 8, daled is 4 for 13. So we see that the idea of loving is connected to the idea of unification. They're equal to 13. And also we see that there are two words in the Bible for man and woman, ish and isha. Ish is spelled aleph yud shin, and isha is spelled aleph shin hey. And these two words have two letters in common, the word for man and woman. The letters they have in common are aleph and shin, which spell aish, fire. But the letters they have uniquely to each other are the yud and the hey. And so the man and the woman, if they have God in their lives, God, one of the names of God is yud and hey, so they're able to control, so to speak, that Aish, that fire. They're left with much more than just fire, because fire becomes in the Torah an expression of spirituality. And so the man and the woman, the Ish and the Isha, when they combine, they're able to be vehicles to express godliness and to express love and express giving, and that becomes the way in which we're able to build intimacy with God. So I'll just run through a few other sources here. There are so many. In the book of Proverbs, chapter 18, verse 22, it says, "He who finds a wife finds goodness and obtains favor from the Lord." It doesn't say that if you find a wife, you've made a mistake. Solomon says, if you find a wife, you've found goodness. And in doing that, you obtain favor from the Lord. So you see that, having a wife and being married is, in the Bible's terms, a good thing, an important thing. In Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, so here we have the most powerful poem, really, in the entire Bible. If you read it, it seems like a very erotic love poem. It describes a very, very passionate, romantic relationship between a man and a woman. And we're told that this is a metaphor for the love between God and either God and the Jewish people as a whole, or God and every individual that's able to have this closeness with God. And we see in the book of, in Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, chapter 6, verse 3, "I am for my beloved, and my beloved is for me." And this idea of the marriage being a symbol of closeness between human beings and God, we find in the prophet Hosea, chapter 2, verse 21, where the prophet says, "I will betroth you to me forever." God is speaking about his attachment to the people of Israel. He's going to marry them forever, he says. So this idea that marriage is a metaphor for closeness with God is a metaphor which goes throughout the entire Bible. In 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 18, so we know that Elkanah was married to Hannah, and she didn't have any children. And, she's basically totally bereft. But he says to her in verse 8, 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 8, "Aren't I better for you than 10 sons?" Meaning that the marriage is more than just about having children. There's a value, an important value to the relationship itself. Just the love and bonding between a man and a woman, that's what he says to Hannah in the first chapter. The Talmud says, I'll just quote one more thing from the Bible before I get to the Talmud. So in Ecclesiastes, Kohelet, chapter 9, verse 9, Solomon says, "Enjoy life with the wife that you love." Enjoy life with the wife that you love. So we see that marriage is for companionship. At the Jewish marriage ceremony, under the marriage canopy, so one of the blessings speaks about the couple as Re'im Ahuvim, which means beloved friends. So it's basically one of the most important things in a marriage is companionship, friendship, and a closeness in relationship. And these are terms, what I'm trying to point out here is that in this entire chapter, Paul doesn't speak about any of these things. So back to the Talmud. The Talmud says in Tractate Yevamot 62b, "He who is unmarried lives without joy, without blessing, without goodness." Now, it's important, again, that this is not an absolute, because people that are single can have joy and blessing and goodness. It doesn't mean that these are things that are unachievable for someone that's single. But there's a certain quality of joy and blessing and goodness that comes about only through the companionship and the love between a married couple, That kind of goodness is not available to someone who's unmarried. And so the Talmud says that someone who's unmarried is only really half of a person, because they're missing this ability for them to have and experience the ultimate blessings in life. But again, we shouldn't walk away from this passage of Talmud and assume that people who are single are not able to have fulfilling lives. That's just not true at all. Just one last idea, which is that in the Torah, and at least in rabbinic thought, marriage has a term for marriage, and the term is kiddushin. That's the term that's used for marriage. And kiddushin means holiness. That in the Jewish perspective, marriage is something that's totally holy. There's nothing that's degraded or sullied about it at all. If you think about marriage in the terms that Paul does, where it's simply a way to help people control their urges, that doesn't sound like the holiest thing in the world. But from a biblical point of view, we see that there are so many positive aspects to marriage that the rabbis refer to marriage as kiddushin, as holiness. So those are just a few, 10 or so sources dealing with the biblical perspective on marriage. In verses 10 and 11 here, so I'm just going to read it. Paul says, "To the married I give this charge, not I, but the Lord." Seems to be saying this is not his personal opinion, but he's saying this is something that apparently Jesus revealed to him. "The wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. And the husband should not divorce his wife." I think at some point Jesus says that the husband can divorce his wife if there is unchastity. But normally it sounds like the teaching of Jesus and Paul is that people should stay together and not get divorced, except for the exceptional case of unchastity, of I guess cheating, adultery. But what Paul says here is that a woman who does separate from her husband, does divorce her husband, should not get remarried to someone else. Paul seems to say the only options are either to remain unmarried after divorce or to be reconciled to her husband. This is obviously a problem in terms of the Torah, because in Deuteronomy chapter 24, the Torah does permit divorce. There's no idea that divorce is something which is not allowed except for adultery. Because interestingly, when adultery happens, they don't have to decide to get divorced. They're not allowed to live together anymore.
Wow.
So the Torah seems to permit divorce in a case where the couple is incompatible, where they just have, as we say today, irreconcilable differences. And actually, I've spoken with Christians who say divorce is sinful, it's not allowed. And I said that for God to prohibit divorce would be the ultimate in cruelty, meaning to force a couple to stay together if they're just totally, at war with each other and totally hating each other and not getting along. That would seem to be, to me at least, the ultimate cruelty on God's part.
Right.
So we see in Deuteronomy 24 that divorce is allowed. The only question is, what are the grounds for divorce? What has to happen? And basically, Jewish law says that, if they are not getting along to the point where marriage is unhealthy, they're at each other's throats, and it's just, the relationship is just, unhealthy, and it's counterproductive. Then, if they decide that they want to end the marriage, they can do that. And it's important to say that in Deuteronomy 24, they're permitted to marry other people after the divorce, which goes totally against what Paul and Jesus seem to be teaching here. I'm sorry, did I interrupt you?
No.
William?
I was that was interesting the way that that you had put that. That's a really good point. That I mean, if a married couple is really so at odds where there's just no peace, especially, I mean, and it's kind of one of those sensitive things too, because the people are wondering, well, what if you have kids? Well, if the kids are being tortured by this too, it almost seems like something's got to be done for the sake of peace, you would think.
Well, that's a good point you're raising, by the way. I mean, when it comes to the couple themselves, it's obvious that sometimes ending the marriage is the best thing to do. The problem is with their children, and unfortunately with the children, they're going to be hurt either way.
Right.
Meaning,
Sure.
if the parents stay together and they hate each other, and it's a house which is it's always World War III in the house, that's going to really hurt the kids. On the other hand, if the parents divorce, and the kids have to be shuttled back and forth to different homes, and it's either way, it's really, really bad for the children.
Right.
That's really unfortunate. There's no fixing that up. There's no way of making that any better. And I think that's why, I think that people have to be careful when they marry. That, they shouldn't marry casually, and they have to ideally, try to get help to save a marriage that's in trouble.
Right.
Because it's really, for children, it's bad either way. But if there are no children involved, or if the children, let's say, grown up already and they're out of the house, I think that it's obvious that it's far better for the couple to end their marriage rather than to stay together and be so miserable that it's going to destroy their lives. It's very clear that there are times when the referee has to step in and say, okay, we're calling this. this is not good.
In a way, it's kind of like, I guess you could say, like, could be a cancerous cell in your elbow, and it's coming up to your heart. Your fingers are fine, but you've got a cancer in your elbow and it's chasing towards your heart. Well, if you leave it on for the sake of your hand, it could kill you.
Yeah.
So something
good point.
Get rid of the arm. So.
Good point. Okay, so let's try and bring this ship to the dock to finish the chapter. So Paul gets into a whole discussion about the need for people to, it's interesting, to sort of maintain the status quo in their lives. He has a passage in this chapter I'm not going to get into about slavery and whether, slavery can be maintained or not maintained. I'm not going to touch that one. But he also speaks about circumcision, and he seems to say that, for people that are not Jewish, that are not circumcised, he seems to say it's just better that they don't get circumcised. He doesn't see the purpose. As a matter of fact, Paul often dealt with this challenge that there were what he calls Judaizers in the church who would keep on pushing Gentiles to get circumcised and to, basically convert to Judaism. And Paul basically is very against that. I mean, we're going to see when we get to the book of Galatians, he gets very nasty with, what he sees as the circumcision people. He says, I hope you guys, that you end up castrating yourselves when you're doing circumcisions.
Right.
But he says in the same way, Jews that are circumcised should keep the circumcision, because we know that back in the first century and other times, there were people who underwent operations to reverse their circumcisions, which I think, God, that's got to hurt. But for whatever reasons, we know that in the times of the Greeks, when they used to perform in athletic events naked, so a lot of the Jewish people that wanted to assimilate, they didn't want to perform the athletic events circumcised, so they would actually reverse their circumcisions. And it could be that in the early church, where there were Jews that were the minority in a Gentile church that was growing, they may have also wanted to, reverse their circumcision. So Paul says, look, if you're Jewish and you're circumcised, keep your circumcision. And I just want to read in verse, he says in verse 19, for neither circumcision counts for anything nor uncircumcision, meaning that circumcision doesn't count for anything, or uncircumcision. It doesn't make a difference, he says. But keeping the commandments of God, that's what makes a difference. So it's obviously a difficult passage to understand, because isn't circumcision a commandment for certain people? So if circumcision is a commandment, how could he say it doesn't mean anything? What doesn't count for anything? So it's clear to me, at least, that 1 Corinthians, this is being written to a Gentile church. So for Gentiles, it's true, it's not a commandment, and there's no need for them to get circumcised. Another way of looking at this, possibly, I don't know if this is the case, is that when Paul seems to differentiate between circumcision and the other commandments, so maybe Paul would say that circumcision is a ritual commandment or a ceremonial commandment, and what counts for Paul are the non-ritual, non-ceremonial commandments like love thy neighbor, etc. And that's why he may be poo-pooing circumcision. It's not clear if that's really what he means here. Another possibility is that for Paul, and this actually comes up in his writings, the terms circumcision and uncircumcision are code for Jew and non-Jew, meaning that for traditional Jews, these are people that Paul calls the circumcision, those who are circumcised. And he may be in this passage saying that it doesn't make a difference if you're Jewish or not Jewish, because we know that in other books of Paul, like in Galatians chapter 3, verse 28, Paul says it doesn't make a difference if you're a man or a woman or a Jew or a Gentile. He says all are one in the body of the Messiah. So that's what he may be referring to here, that he's saying that your status doesn't make a difference, whether you're from the uncircumcised or you're of the people who are circumcised. Not speaking about circumcision per se, he's speaking about people who are uncircumcised or people who are circumcised. Paul says it doesn't really count for anything. As far as, the New Testament faith is concerned, all that matters is your faith in Jesus, not your ethnic background. Now, one of the really, really important parts of this chapter is, I'm going to start with verse 25 here. So Paul says, now concerning the betrothed, so concerning people who are engaged to be married, I have no command from the Lord. So Paul says that, when it comes to people who are engaged, because he's discussed already people who are single and people who are married, but what about people who are sort of in between? They're engaged. So he says that I don't have any particular revelation that I received from Jesus. But I give my judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. So he says, I'm going to give you my personal opinion here.
This is really interesting, because this is, if there's at least one place in Paul's writings where he confesses that this is not God speaking, this is me with my own personal understanding, doesn't it stand to reason that this has happened throughout the New Testament as well? People say that the New Testament is the divine, like every single tiny word is specifically from God, and it's like, well, Paul right here, at least in this one spot anyway, declares differently.
Yes, I say bingo. As a matter of fact, he sort of says the same thing in verse 40. In verse 39, he says, a wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives. But if her husband dies, she is free to be married to whom she wishes. So Paul has said previously that if a woman divorces her husband, she can't remarry. But if her husband dies, she's free to remarry, Paul says. Yet in my judgment, Paul says in verse 40, in my judgment,
right,
she is happier if she remains as she is. And I think that I too have the Spirit of God. So I think both of these verses, the one that you pointed out and this verse in verse 40, Paul seems to be sort of signaling the fact that he's giving you his own personal point of view. And you're right, 100% right, that it's very difficult to square that with the idea that every word of the Christian Bible is revealed and inspired and divinely revealed. It seems, and I think we mentioned a few other places where it's pretty clear that Paul is, he speaks about, he writes a letter and he says, but I forgot my galoshes and I have to go and pick them up. I mean, it's pretty clear that a lot of Paul's letters are simply that. They're letters that he writes.
Right.
And it's very, very hard, if we really go through all of it to say, oh, sure, this was divinely revealed. But yes, I think that
Kind
you're
of
right.
goes with the Gospels too, with the story accounts of the resurrection and all these other stories of when Passover/Easter took place, all the variable, different stories that took place, the different accounts. They weren't, vantage points difference. They were like blatant contradictions. So, if
Right. That's because you have scales that cover your eyes and you can't see the truth.
yeah, it's like a kaleidoscope, right? I see all these patterns. Right.
You're right. I mean, look, there are many reasons to question this, doctrine of you know, of every word being divinely revealed and biblical inerrancy. It's a difficult, doctrine, and I think you're right. This passage here, Paul seems to sort of signal to us that this is his own stuff.
Right.
So he says in verse 26, he says, I think that in view of the present distress, it is good for a person to remain as he is. Now, what is this present distress? And it seems, according to many commentaries, that this might be one of the reasons. Now, he actually gives several reasons in this chapter for why it's good not to be married. We're going to see that, he says, for example, that, being married, you can't focus on God so much. You're so caught up with, having to go do chores and, and attend to your spouse. And it keeps you very, very busy. And you're just caught up with so many things that distract you from a spiritual life. That's another reason that he, it says it's better to stay single. But here he speaks about the present distress, and that's another reason for not getting married. So there are many, many commentaries as to what this might mean. Some of the commentaries say that it may be referring to the famine that took place in the years 51 and 52, which caused tremendous food shortages in Greece. And we know that in the Gospels, Jesus warned of the great distress that pregnant women and nursing mothers will experience in the end times. You see that in Luke chapter 21, verse 23. So it may be easier for single people to live through this kind of tribulation, if they don't have the burden of a family to deal with. And Dr. Tabor, James Tabor, in his book Paul and Jesus, takes a similar view about this present distress. He says that it's pretty clear from this passage that Paul was expecting that Jesus would return very soon in the clouds of the heavens. And, if the apocalypse and, the rapture and the end times could come at any moment, so there wasn't really much time for people to pursue normal relationships, normal marital life, and many things, actually. He speaks in this chapter here about even commerce, right? That so many things, they don't really work in the same way if, the second coming is going to happen at any moment. And it's interesting that a lot of historians used to compare the Essenes to the Jesus movement. I think at one point there were even people who said that Jesus himself may have been an Essene, and that the Christian, the early Christians may have been Essenes. There are many reasons why they say this. The idea of living communally,
right.
which we see took place a little bit, and also the idea of not being married, the ideal of not being married. You see that Jesus wasn't married, and I don't know about any of the other apostles, but Paul certainly wasn't married. And the Essenes also remained celibate for the most part. And the Essenes were a group that expected, that the end times are upon them. So I don't really buy this connection between Jesus and the Essenes, but there are similarities, and it seems that one of the similarities is that when you're expecting the end of the world to come, then normal life doesn't really continue easily. And that's what Paul says here in verse 31. Paul says, This is what I mean, brothers. The appointed time has grown very short. I'm sorry, that was verse 29. This is what I mean, brothers. The appointed time has grown very short. From now on, let those who have wives live as though they had none. So even if you're married, you should live as if you don't have a wife. And he says in verse 31, and those who deal with the world as though they had no dealings with it, for the present form of this world is passing away. Meaning that the present world order, as far as Paul was concerned, is almost finished. They were expecting basically the end of the world very, very soon. And so the way Dr. Tabor understands the problem that Paul was dealing with in this chapter, he describes it as already but not yet. That Paul was dealing with a scenario where, as far as he was concerned, the end times were already upon them, because Paul taught that by being sort of born again, believers become reborn in Jesus. This is a major theme in Paul's writings, to be sort of in Christ, as he puts it. And so the problem Paul dealt with was that if, from a believer's point of view, from people that are born again believers, you would think that according to what Paul understood, these are people that shouldn't have to be struggling with the desires of their flesh. And yet Paul saw that, the church was to a great extent not there yet. So that's one of the problems that Paul was facing, that as far as he was concerned, the world has changed. With the coming of Jesus, people have been transformed. There's a new reality, and that's what should be happening. But Paul realizes, but it's not there yet. And so he struggles with those who don't have this gift, meaning that there are people, from Paul's point of view, who don't have the gift like himself of being able to live a non-physical kind of life. And therefore, the current order of the world, Paul realizes is complicated. But he believes that it's going to change, with the return of Jesus, and then everything is going to become spiritual. So the other possibility is that this is not referring to the belief that the end times are upon them, but either, as I mentioned before, that there is a particular crisis with a famine, or many commentaries say that it may have been referring specifically to the upcoming Roman persecution of the Christian church. So there may have been things going on in that first century that caused Paul to be reluctant to have people live sort of standard kind of lives, or it may have been the expectation that the entire world order was going to change soon. And I think that's really all I wanted to bring out in this chapter.
Okay.
So thank you for your patience.
Hey, that was actually quite a lot. In fact, there was more there than I actually thought would be turned over. That was kind of cool. Yeah. So
Okay.
even just seeing the part, just really proving and hammering down the point that there's no possibility that the entire, even if parts of the New Testament were inspired by certain people at the time, you always have this possibility. Well, maybe maybe there were some things that they taught that were actually good, and we've explored some of those things. There's good concepts that they have actually discussed and shared, but the idea that it's all divinely, specifically hand delivered from God is absurd. And that's speaking mildly, in my opinion. So. Of course, that is my opinion. I do believe I am filled with the Holy Ghost. So anyway.
Just be careful.
Yes.
Going outside, because the lightning bolts are not very accurate these days.
That's funny. Cool. Well, Rabbi, you did a great job as usual, and I look forward to seeing you again on our next show, whenever that may be. Hopefully next week, same time, same place.
Next week, God willing.
God willing. I mean, hope you guys have a great week, Shavuot Tov, and
you as well.
Thank you, Rabbi.
All the best.
Thank you. Shalom,
Laila
everybody.
Tov.
We'll see you guys later. Shalom. Bye-bye.
חשוב מכל חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד. איפוק זו העוצמה, ויתור זו הגדולה, השאיפה והכמיהה. אני אתה אתם תמיד תמיד כולם ביחד, חשוב מכל חשוב